Ravi had spent months talking to Leena online, dreaming of the day they would finally meet. But when he flew from India to surprise her in Florida, he never imagined that the woman he had fallen for weighed 380 kilograms, and that his dream encounter would turn into a nightmare he could barely survive. It started in a small apartment in India where nights were often quiet and lonely. The man had a routine that rarely changed. He worked long hours, returned home tired, ate simple meals, and spent his evenings online to escape the silence around him. Social media became his window to the outside world, a place where time passed faster and loneliness felt lighter. One evening, a notification appeared on his screen. A woman from Florida had sent him a friend request. Her profile showed soft lighting, carefully angled photos, and captions filled with positive words. She appeared kind, gentle, and thoughtful. Curious, he accepted. At first, the interaction felt casual and harmless. They exchanged messages about daily life, hobbies, and small frustrations. There was nothing unusual, nothing that raised concern. Days turned into weeks. Their messages became longer and more personal. She spoke about living alone, about struggling with health problems that kept her inside most of the time. She described Florida as warm but isolating, a place where people passed by without noticing her existence. Her words made him feel needed. He listened carefully, offering comfort and reassurance whenever she seemed low. Over time, their connection deepened. Calls replaced texts. He adjusted his sleep schedule to match her time zone, staying awake late into the night just to hear her voice. She sounded soft and calm, often emotional. She talked about dreams of love, trust, and finally being understood by someone who saw her for who she truly was. Each conversation pulled him in further. She shared pictures regularly, always taken from similar angles. The lighting was dim, and her face was often partially visible. When he asked for clearer photos or video calls, she gently avoided the topic. She explained that her health made her uncomfortable on camera. She said she was ashamed of how illness had changed her body. He believed her without question. Months passed, and the emotional bond grew strong. She spoke about a future together, about meeting one day and starting fresh. She said traveling was impossible for her because of medical reasons. Her condition kept her confined, dependent on others for basic needs. The idea of her suffering alone made him feel guilty. He felt responsible, as if he was the only one who truly cared. Slowly, the idea formed in his mind. If she could not travel, he would. The thought felt brave and romantic. It felt like proof of commitment. He imagined her surprise, her gratitude, and the beginning of a real life together. He did not tell his family. He feared their questions and doubts. This was his decision, and he wanted it to remain pure, untouched by suspicion. He began planning in secret. He saved money, applied for leave from work, and gathered documents for a visa. Each step made the situation feel more real. Each approval felt like fate pushing him forward. She encouraged him, reminding him how much his presence would mean to her. She promised everything would be different once they were together. As the travel date approached, his excitement mixed with anxiety. Small doubts surfaced late at night, but he pushed them away. He told himself that love required risk. He packed gifts, carefully chosen items that represented his culture and affection. In his mind, this journey was not just a visit. It was a turning point, a leap into a future shaped by trust. On the night before departure, he sat alone, staring at his packed suitcase. His heart raced with anticipation. He believed he was walking toward happiness, unaware that this decision would lead him into a reality far darker than anything he had imagined. The flight to Florida felt endless. Hours blended together as he moved from one airport to another, surrounded by strangers and announcements he barely noticed. His body was exhausted, but his mind stayed awake, replaying every message she had ever sent. He imagined her smile, the way her voice softened when she said his name, and the moment she would see him standing at her door. That image kept him moving forward. When he finally landed, the warm air hit him immediately. Florida felt different from anything he knew. The sky was wide and bright, and the city moved fast around him. He collected his luggage, rented a small car, and entered the address she had given him into the navigation system. As he drove, his excitement grew stronger. Each mile felt like a step closer to something meaningful. The streets slowly changed. Busy roads turned into quieter ones. Clean buildings faded into older houses with faded paint and overgrown lawns. The neighborhood felt strangely empty. He told himself that every place had areas like this and that appearances could be misleading. The navigation voice guided him to a narrow street where the houses sat far apart. When he stopped in front of the house, he hesitated. The structure looked worn and neglected. Trash bags were piled near the entrance. The windows were covered, blocking any view inside. The yard was overgrown, and there was no sign of life. His heart tightened. This was not what he had imagined. Still, he reminded himself that illness could change a person's living conditions. He took a deep breath and walked to the door. He knocked and waited. The silence felt heavy. Just as he wondered if he had made a mistake, the door slowly opened. What he saw froze him in place. The woman standing there did not resemble the images he had seen online. Her body was massive, far beyond what he could have prepared for. She weighed nearly 380 kilograms. Her movements were slow and difficult, and her breathing was labored. Shock rushed through him. His mind struggled to process the difference between the woman in front of him and the person he thought he knew. For a brief moment, he considered turning around and leaving, but the journey, the effort, and the emotional investment held him there. He stepped inside, telling himself that appearances were not everything. The interior of the house was dark and unclean. The smell was overwhelming. Pathways were narrow, blocked by clutter and old furniture. Medical supplies were scattered across the floor. It was clear that she spent most of her time in one area, unable to move freely. This was not a temporary situation. It was her reality. He sat down, unsure of what to say or do. His emotions collided inside him. There was confusion, disappointment, pity, and guilt all at once. He felt ashamed of his own reaction. He reminded himself that he had come out of care, not judgment. As time passed, the initial shock faded into an uneasy acceptance. He noticed how dependent she was on her environment. Simple tasks required effort or assistance. He realized that the life she described online had been carefully shaped, hiding the full truth of her condition. That night, as he lay awake in an unfamiliar space, reality settled in. He was far from home, inside a house that felt more like a trap than a refuge. The excitement that once fueled him was gone, replaced by a quiet fear he could not ignore. He wondered if coming here had been the biggest mistake of his life. Inside the house, the air was heavy and oppressive. Dust-coated surfaces and the faint smell of decay hung in the corners. Every step he took was careful, navigating around stacks of old newspapers, empty containers, and medical equipment that suggested long-term illness. The reality of her life pressed down on him. It was nothing like the images she had sent or the life she had described online. She was not just overweight. She was almost completely immobile, relying on nearby surfaces and equipment for support. Every movement she made required immense effort, and even small tasks left her breathless. He began to notice patterns that made him uneasy. The house was isolated, far from neighbors or passers-by. The few times he looked out the windows, he saw only empty streets, the occasional car passing slowly, and yards overgrown like this one. It became clear that she lived in almost total seclusion. He realized that for years she had hidden herself from the world, cultivating a digital persona that was almost impossible to question. Her online life had been carefully crafted, showing only what she wanted others to see, masking her true condition. Soon, he found documents and notes scattered across a small table. They revealed more than just her health struggles. She kept meticulous records of her online communications, lists of men who had sent her money, gifts, or attention, and reminders about how to maintain the illusion. He felt a cold shiver as he realized he was not the first man to be drawn into this web. Some of the men she mentioned had even visited, only to leave after encountering the truth. For years she had relied on this pattern, using loneliness, illness, and charm to create connections that gave her both emotional satisfaction and material support. fear began to creep in. He discovered that his phone had been tampered with, its signals restricted. His passport, which he had carefully kept on him, was missing from the small safe he had been shown. Panic set in. He was alone in a foreign country, trapped in a house where someone's control was absolute. The woman had no intention of letting him leave easily, he realized. The initial shock he felt when he saw her wait had now evolved into a more pressing fear. He was entangled in a situation where leaving might not be simple. At the same time, he could not ignore the human side of it. Despite the deception, her condition was real. She struggled to breathe, to eat, to even sit upright without support. Her body had suffered from years of neglect, isolation, and immobility. Each movement she made was a battle. He felt an almost unbearable mix of anger, pity, and compassion. He understood that beneath the manipulation there was suffering that could not be denied. She was trapped in her own body, and for years she had used the world outside her home to fill the emptiness that her body had created. Days passed slowly. The house felt smaller and more suffocating with each hour. He realized that he was being forced into a caretaker role, whether he wanted it or not. Meals had to be prepared, medical needs attended to, and her fragile emotional state managed carefully. Any misstep might provoke anger or despair. The fantasy of a romantic visit dissolved, replaced by the harshness of reality. Each day, he weighed the decision of leaving against the knowledge that if he tried, there could be confrontation, or worse, no opportunity at all. Through all of this, he began documenting everything. Every interaction, every discovery, every subtle warning sign became a record of his experience. He hoped it would help him maintain a sense of control in a situation that otherwise felt hopeless. The house, once a symbol of promise, had become a cage. He understood fully that the woman's dependence on him was not about affection. It was about survival, manipulation, and a need to maintain her carefully constructed world. The lines between victim and perpetrator blurred, leaving him uncertain about what would come next. The days that followed were filled with tension and unease. He had hoped that after the initial shock, things might settle into some kind of normal routine, but the reality was far more oppressive. Every movement he made in the house was closely observed, every decision felt weighted. He tried to plan ways to contact the outside world, but discovered that his phone service had been restricted, and the few devices available to him were monitored or disabled. Even the mail that arrived was intercepted or never reached him. The realization that he was effectively trapped in a foreign country with no immediate means of escape sent a wave of panic through him. He spent hours observing the woman, trying to understand her patterns. She was almost entirely confined to one room, rarely leaving her chair or bed. Her breathing was shallow and strained, and each small task required assistance or careful planning. Meals were laborious to prepare and deliver to her. The environment was chaotic, the house cluttered and unsafe, but he knew that attempting to leave or move around too quickly could provoke her. Every action needed caution, and yet he felt the crushing weight of time pressing on him. Desperation began to grow. He attempted to reach neighbors, but the house's location on a quiet, isolated street made encounters rare. When he did see someone, they seemed wary, perhaps aware of the woman's reputation or simply cautious of outsiders. He realized that no one around him would intervene unless he found a way to communicate directly with authorities. Yet any attempt to do so carried risks. He had already noticed subtle threats in her behavior, sullen stares, manipulative pleas, and sudden mood shifts whenever he tried to assert his independence. Then the situation took a darker turn. He noticed that the woman's health was deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing worsened, and her movements became more labored. She seemed weaker than the previous day, and panic began to replace his earlier caution. The severity of her condition left him with a terrifying choice: act quickly to summon help or risk being trapped in a collapsing environment with someone whose life was in immediate danger. He realized that any delay could have catastrophic consequences. In a moment of clarity, he found a way. Using a borrowed device from a delivery service, he carefully sent a message to local authorities. He wrote in detail about his location, the woman's condition, and the dangers present in the house. It was a small act, but it gave him a fragile sense of control. While waiting for a response, he tried to keep the woman comfortable, ensuring she had water and food, even as he feared she might collapse at any moment. The tension reached its peak when the woman suddenly lost consciousness. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, and he realized she might not survive without immediate medical attention. He acted instinctively, calling emergency services and attempting basic first aid to the extent he could. The hours stretched unbearably as he waited for help, the fear of what might happen before their arrival gnawing at him. When the authorities finally arrived, the scene was chaotic. Medical personnel rushed inside while police officers secured the house. Despite the intervention, it was clear that the woman's condition had reached a critical point. Every detail of the situation, the isolation, the neglect, the deception, was laid bare in front of him. He felt a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that help had come, and horror at the realization that the situation had spiraled into a near-fatal crisis. In those final hours, he understood the full scope of what he had stumbled into. The web of lies and manipulation, the fragile and dangerous reality of her life, and his own vulnerability in a foreign land created a perfect storm. He had come seeking love, adventure, and connection, but instead he found himself fighting to survive and to ensure someone else did too. The desperate attempt to reach help became a defining moment, showing both the fragility of human life and the unforeseen dangers of trusting appearances. By the time emergency personnel arrived, the house was a scene of chaos and urgency. The man stood to the side, his body tense, his mind reeling from the events that had unfolded over the past days. The woman, barely conscious, was immediately attended to by paramedics who assessed her fragile condition. It became clear within minutes that her health had deteriorated beyond what anyone could stabilize on the scene. Every breath she took seemed shallow, labored, a fight against a body that had long been neglected. Despite their best efforts, she was declared dead, her fragile life extinguished before the man's eyes. The aftermath was overwhelming. Police began questioning him in detail, carefully recording his account of the journey, the deception, and the conditions inside the house. Investigators combed through the property, documenting every aspect of her life. The clutter, the medical equipment, the stacks of records detailing previous online relationships and manipulations. The man had been drawn into a carefully constructed world, a world designed to isolate, control, and trap those who became entangled with her. Authorities discovered a pattern that was both tragic and alarming. The woman had relied on deception to maintain relationships for years, creating a digital persona that masked her true condition. Men had sent her money, gifts, and emotional attention, believing her story. Some had even traveled, only to encounter the harsh reality they had not anticipated. Her home was both a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she maintained control while simultaneously being trapped by her own body and illness. The man had entered this environment unknowingly, his intentions genuine, but ultimately caught in a situation far beyond what he had imagined. As the investigation unfolded, it became evident that he bore no responsibility for her death. His actions had been guided by care, concern, and an attempt to survive a difficult and manipulative environment. Authorities confirmed that her demise was the result of long-term health issues exacerbated by isolation and extreme obesity. Despite the shocking nature of the situation, he was released, allowed to return to his country with the burden of memory and trauma weighing heavily on him. Returning to India, he found himself in a strange limbo. The journey that had begun with hope and anticipation ended with grief, confusion, and a deep sense of betrayal. He reflected on the months of messages, calls, and shared dreams, realizing that much of what he had experienced had been carefully orchestrated. The trust he had placed in the woman had been genuine, but it had been exploited, manipulated, and twisted into something far darker than a simple misunderstanding. The emotional toll was immense, leaving him cautious, wary, and deeply introspective. The story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers that can lie behind digital connections. It illustrated how appearances carefully curated and controlled, can hide realities that are dangerous, isolating, and even deadly. The man's journey from hope to horror served as an example of how easily one can be drawn into a situation where empathy and trust intersect with manipulation and deception. He returned home carrying lessons that were painfully learned, aware that the digital world can mask extreme truths, and that sometimes what seems like love can hide a trap. Even months later, he struggled to reconcile the memory of the woman with the reality he had encountered. The images of her in life, the cluttered house, the fragile body, and the sudden collapse haunted him. Yet alongside the fear and sorrow, there was also a measure of understanding. He had survived, and through that survival, he had gained insight into human nature, vulnerability, and the thin line between hope and danger. The tragedy left a permanent mark, a reminder that not every promise made online is genuine, and that sometimes the most profound lessons are learned in the harshest of circumstances. The story ended not with justice or closure, but with reflection. It highlighted the extremes of human isolation, the dangers of deception, and the unpredictable consequences of crossing borders, both physical and emotional, for someone who only existed online. The man's journey, filled with hope, shock, and survival, became a testament to resilience in the face of unexpected tragedy, a story that reminded all who heard it that reality often hides beneath carefully constructed illusions.